the 2022 ACC Debate Championship final round. We have a couple of thank yous to get started before we let the debaters be the prime time event of the evening. The first thank you we have to start with is the broader ACC Academic Consortium, and in particular, Provost Quigley from Boston College. Last year, you may remember that we used to have former Provost Dave Brown, who was a part of this event for a long time. And then when Provost Quigley took over, we had a really short time frame to get a chance to talk about the tournament, to see if we could make it happen. And he gave his full-throated support from the outset. So thank you to Provost Quigley for that support and making this event possible. Of course, our hope, as we were chatting about in the pre-round banter, is that it would be transitioning from the virtual event to the more in-person event again next year. So we're really thankful that we could at least make it happen in this virtual world. Second, I'd love to thank the debaters. It's the end of the semester. For many of them, they had a lot of other ways they could have spent an entire Saturday that started at 7 a.m. and is going to finish after 7 p.m. And instead of doing what many of their peers are doing and just thinking about final exams or just going outside to enjoy a beautiful April day, they stuck to their computers and for what will be over 13 hours engaged in conversation, debate, and great arguments with each other. So we cannot thank the debaters enough from all the institutions that participated, including our institutions that represent the final round. Finally, I'd love to thank our judges for this evening. So we have a panel of 5 great judges who are joining us, including Jan Hovden, who's the Director of Debate and Lecturer in Rhetoric, Film, and Screen Studies at Bates College. Ed Lee, who is the Senior Director of the Alban W. Barkley Forum for Debate, Deliberation, and Dialogue. Dr. Becca Steiner, who's the Melissa Maxey Wade Debate and Dialogue Specialist for Competitive Debate at Emory University. James Rowland, who's the Senior Director of Civic and Community Engagement at Emory University. Dave Romanelli, who's the Senior Instructor and Director at the Loyola University College Debating Society. All 5 of these amazing judges represent a huge experience of intercollegiate debate across a huge variety of formats, and it really is something that makes the ACC debate tournament so special that we're able to have these brilliant judges come and judge all day long, including in this final round. Finally, I'd like to thank the co-chair, Dave Steinberg, who is here right now and is also representing the University of Miami, who represents a team in the final round, entering as the top seed with a 3-1 preliminary record coming in and having the top 2 speakers after the preliminary debates were over with. So welcome, Dave Steinberg and the University of Miami. And then our other team this evening who will actually be on the affirmative is the Wake Forest University Demon Deacons. Now, the topic for tonight's debate is resolved. The new urban agenda should be a sustainable development priority. The teams have flipped the sides that they debate each other in the preliminary debates. So Wake Forest will be on the affirmative and the University of Miami will be on the negative. So without further ado, unless there's anyone else that has anything else important to say, I suggest we turn it over to the debaters to let them entertain us with their brilliance for the ACC Debate Championship for 2022.
Else has any words, unless you do. But I do obviously have some thank yous. First, I want to thank my family, Chicago, and God for giving me the opportunity to be here today and enjoy my last debate for the semester. Next, I want to thank the ACC, the judges, and Miami for making this tournament one of a kind and making me grow on how I could think about the world differently. Next, I want to thank Wake Forest, President Wentzy, Provost Kirsch, Dean Gillespie, McGann Medica, Justin Green, Brianna Aaron, and everyone else who made it possible through your support, assistance, and your commitment to Wake Debate and Wake MP. And finally, I want to thank Eon. We joked about coming to the ACC for months, and here we finally are in the final round. So it's been a blessing to have my final debate with you for this semester, and I can't be more proud of your tremendous work that you put into the activity. And it's definitely one of the GOATs. So that's all I got, and let's get started. I will start in 10 seconds if no one else is ready, or just interrupt me. All right, let's get this show on the road. Before we get into the merits of today's debate over the topic, should the United Nations make the new urban agenda a global priority, examination of some basic facts are in order. Fact 1, the world is urbanizing. This is a trend that will simply not disappear. Gosh says in 2019 that since 1950, the world's urban population has risen almost sixfold to 4.2 billion in 2018. Living in a rural area provides less job opportunities. Farming and the unpredictable nature of the environmental factors such as rain and drought leads to a fluctuating income. Two is that sheer population growth and mechanization in agriculture. National Geographic explains in 2022 that our economies have become much more industrialized, and as a result, many more people have moved into cities. This process is also known as urbanization. Fact two, the drive for economic development will not go away. It is inevitable. There's two major reasons. The first is that economic and political elites who possess power in the world are not going to do anything besides drive for a model of development. Butch Hansen says in 2018 that degrowth is nowhere near enjoying the degree and support it needs if the number of political parties have embraced degrowth is modest, but economic and political elites are united that growth is necessary and desirable. In addition, the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions notes that 70% of our emissions comes from energy consumption, and the UN acknowledges that upwards of 80% of our emissions comes from cities alone. This means only refashioning development at the city level can create a world that stops climate catastrophe and death from massive global poverty. Cosi Piper says last year that the degrowth movement argues the only solution is an extreme transformation in our way of life. There are two problems. One is that it doesn't add up, and two is that it will be impossible to implement. It's not a serious policy program to solve climate change, especially in a world where billions still live in poverty. Hosfather, a climate scientist at a Breakthrough Institute, says that green energy has gotten cheap. His research finds evidence of absolutely decoupling emissions, shrinking while GDP grows in 32 countries. Big problem with degrowth is this simple fact. In the coming decades, most carbon emissions will be happening in newly middle-income countries like India, China, or Indonesia. Should the world really prioritize curbing emissions and economic growth if it really meant suppressing the growth of those countries? If we are avid about catastrophic warming, we have to lower carbon emissions by a factor of 2 within the next 10 years. I find it highly implausible that capitalism and market economics will be abandoned by the world on that time frame. That means that we have to act on the climate crisis within the framework of the current system. The new urban agenda has historically failed at implementation. This is why we need to prioritize it more. In doing so, the grassroots frames can succeed at implementing economic development in a socially just way. Dr. Alejandra and Adriana Reyes, as well as Dr. Caroline Dangle, says in 2020 that one main obstacle for the implementation of the new urban agenda is that UN Habitat does not have a comprehensive moderating framework. The implementation of policymaking remains voluntary. The implementation of the new urban agenda may be the avenue for city governments to align, formulate, and implement coherent policymaking. Recent studies support an informal synergy between the NUA and the SDGs. The path forward. We affirm the new urban agenda should be a priority for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. As a result of these facts, the only alternative is to remake the world within the structures that already exist. Prioritizing the new urban agenda offers a way to rethink the world of growth in a way that maximizes the involvement of people who are already affected. This results in a strategy that stops multiple existential risks, the loss of biodiversity, ocean pollution, and remaking our cities, and results in privileging of perspectives that guarantee gender, racial, and ethnic minorities. We'll spotlight some of those voices which are crucial. The new urban agenda is especially important as countries struggle to emerge from the COVID-19 crisis, said Botswana, where 1.2 billion people in the global south live in informal settlements, who have strained to implement disease transmission mitigation measures. In the global north, the pandemic pushed many into homelessness, and the new urban agenda must guide our efforts to address inequalities and urbanization. A solid focus on the issue will require the mobilizations of millions of urbanization professionals working in partnership with member states and stakeholders. This means that these developments make the new urban agenda more critical, noting the importance of local action in that regard, based on the idea that the people closest to sustainable development challenges are best to tackle them. This also means that sustainable developments will hinge on how we manage urbanization, urging delegates to examine the issues through the lens of inequality and to review the support provided by the United Nations Development System in the implementation of the new urban agenda. Current discussions should be framed in the context of COVID-19, as well as the challenges such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And we don't just talk about vague generalities. It's a process, and we have multiple examples. One is Singapore, increased centralized planning to increase energy efficiencies. Dubai, a city with inclement weather, developed a hyperloop to decrease auto use, also implemented EV charging stations. Copenhagen and Amsterdam thought about how to increase cycling and walkability. New York asked about how to effectively engage in trash pickup to reduce diesel fuel and stop unnecessary deaths. London instituted an incubator program to fund startups that could make environmental breakthroughs, help businesses. Barcelona also used city resources to invest in zero emission plans that accelerated solar use and tree planting. Finally, the new urban agenda is not an event, and it is a process that should be prioritized and should be the key question of this debate. To quote the UN directly in 2022, rethinking the urban agenda is embracing urbanization at all levels, integrating equity and issue of social justice, fostering national urban planning and planned city extensions. Deciding how relevant sustainable development goals are will be supported. Utilizing the international stage of the United Nations is an effective way to get the word out that people need to be involved to help make decisions to create a truly sustainable agenda for cities, people, and everyone involved in the future. Thank you. And I am open for process.
All right. I'm so sorry. I just need to mute the, because we have echo, so. Sorry, we had some technical issues, but am I audible? Am I audible now? No, it's good. Okay. I will begin in just a second. You mentioned that there are political, religious, ethnic, and different minorities that exist. How are you sure that they're included in the new urban agenda?
I mean, we've proven the argument that there's urbanization happening right now, and obviously multiple people go into cities. Our argument is that we should focus on how we should interact with those cities in particular ways that allow for sustainability being good.
Okay. When the document was created, it originally had the inclusion of LGBTQI communities, and then those communities were then explicitly removed after the fact because of 17 countries. How do you rectify that?
Well, the question is, which newer urban agenda are we talking about? Habitat 1, 2, or 3? Because if it's a question of the third, it will be the way in which we have shifted gears and talked about how we need to prioritize the people as well that don't have the levers of power or have been marginalized within those cities/societies.
How can you ethically say that we need to promote a document which builds itself upon the backbone of the exclusion of certain groups?
Well, the argument is that given that that has already happened, it's a matter of what can we do in the future. I.e., an example would be the idea of like resource removal in the Congo through coltium. Our argument is that through recycling and through engagements of that, we are able to acknowledge that and say that they shouldn't face that danger anymore, as well as having a more efficient model for the people that, depend on those models.
Perfect. Thank you. Wouldn't you agree that priority indicates like urgency, meaning that a priority needs to be done before everything else?
Well, we wouldn't make that argument. Our argument is that even if there's priority, that doesn't mean you can't do other things. Like I have a priority to do my homework, but I should still call my mom, right?
But if you're accomplishing a goal and some goals are a prerequisite to others, wouldn't you agree that accomplishing the prerequisite over the priority is better?
Well, it's not a question of that, right? It's a question of how do we engage in types of violences, right? It's like we prioritize this, but if there's this thing that also helps us lead to that, we could do that too.
Okay, but what about the checks and balances, and what if those things work as a net harm? What if there's a trade-off, something that then
your program? You define those checks and balances.
Oh,
that's very broad.
Well, in our next speech, but thank you. Are you aware that we are currently in like a global democratic breakdown as authoritarian and far-right governments gain more power?
Well, the argument is that right now political elites, whether that's in democracies, well, it's you gotta explain it, because political elites in both democracies as well as authoritarian regimes depend on economic growth. So it's a question of how do we engage with them differently, which are the litany of examples.
How does the new urban agenda then mitigate that said trend?
Yeah, so this is a question of how we should make them more efficient in the guise that we are actually making the people that don't have the levers of power also become included. The multiple examples of like.
Sorry, wouldn't you say that the promotion of like governance then, Sustainable Development Goal 16, should then be a prerequisite for any of the benefits that you gain potentially from the new urban agenda?
Wait, can you repeat that? So governments in what way?
So Sustainable Development Goal number 6, the promotion of governance, wouldn't you say that that's a prerequisite to even enact the new urban agenda?
Well, the new urban agenda is the question of how should we engage in discussions as well as, different models and values. I think that's a prerequisite in terms of implementation that will guide what those individuals do.
Okay, thank you. Who are the #1 drivers of pollution and climate change?
Well, that's the question, right? You might make the
Okay.
argument that companies are that, but it's a
It is
question
a
of the people
corporation.
that actually, no,
That's
it's a question of who engages with the corporations and actually, uses the resources.
well, the answer to that question that I had was that it is multinational corporations. So how does the affirmative then tackle the disproportionate impacts of corporations on climate change?
Well, we'll say that that's false. It's a question of the people that engage with those companies, right? They could produce all they want, but it's the people that have their interaction with them that lead to the emissions in the city, right?
Am I audible? Okay, awesome. Before I begin, I wanted to give a couple of thank yous and shout outs. So first, we'd like to sincerely thank Jared Atchison for his work in organizing and running this entire tournament, to the ACC and the ACC Academic Consortium for supporting it. I want to thank my incredible coaches, Patrick Waldinger and Dave Steinberg, for their incredible coaching and outstanding support as we've worked tirelessly over the past year. Everyone who came out to debate and judge today, to my boyfriend who also woke up early this morning to watch all of these rounds. I want to thank my family who's here for supporting me throughout my debate career for the last 7 years. I've debated since I was 13 years old, a freshman in high school, and now I'm graduating college in 2 weeks. And I couldn't be more grateful for them supporting me and my passion, and for being there for me like this entire journey. And finally, to my incredible, amazing partner, Iman. She is just like the most amazing person. It has been, I don't want to cry. Anyway, it's been a blessing to debate with her. She's just like the best, partner I could have asked for in my last year debating. And with that being said, I hope you find our advocacy persuasive and the dialogue we foster today interesting. And with that, I'll begin on my next word. Zero poverty, zero hunger, reduced inequalities. These are a few of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. These goals encapsulate a vision of a society that protects human rights for every global citizen. Rather than build cities on a broken system, we must rebuild broken systems to rebuild better communities of all kinds. This is why Iman and I proudly negate today's resolution. We offer the following framework. When we weigh impacts in today's round, we want to emphasize that priority is at the heart of this debate. Cambridge Dictionary defines priority as something that you do or deal with first, because it is more important and urgent than other things. The affirmative must prove that the new urban agenda is not only important, but its implementation must be urgent and prioritized above all other global policy initiatives and sustainable development efforts. In light of violent global conflict, the proliferation of authoritarian and far-right governments, and a global pandemic that has accelerated poverty and inequality worldwide, can we really say building better cities should be our #1 priority in 2022? The new urban agenda should not be a priority because it forces too many trade-offs towards the goal of sustainable development for all, which should be the priority in this dialogue. Our case slogan is, you cannot fix the symptoms, you must cure the disease. Cities are nothing more than the symptom of the broken and diseased societies that they are built in. Failing cities are symptomatic of a society riddled by structural issues. We offer 2 key observations about why the new urban agenda should not be a sustainable development priority. First, the new urban agenda is tone deaf and impractical. And second, we should prioritize people and the planet, not cities. Observation 1, new urban agenda is tone deaf and impractical. Firstly, it ignores that societies are not just comprised of cities. Although the affirmative defends its focus on cities by saying that 60% of people will live there in 2030, this ignores over 3 billion people residing in rural areas who are arguably the greatest victims of sustainability and human rights issues. The most unsustainable industries are centered in rural areas like mining, forestry, and agriculture, and they notoriously infringe on the human rights of their workers. To leave rural areas behind not only is a myopic approach to sustainability, but also creates rural resentment, leading to votes for leaders who are not champions of sustainable cities. An example of this is Donald Trump leaving the Paris Climate Accords once he became president, and he was voted in largely by a rural population that felt left behind. Secondly, the new urban agenda does not call for corporate sustainability reforms, which reproduces neocolonialism and neoliberalism, which is a huge oversight that makes mitigating the climate crisis impossible. Josh Axelrod writes for the National Resource Defense Council in 2019 that 100 energy companies have been responsible for 71% of all industrial emissions since human-driven climate change began. And it's not just the energy sector. The top 15 US food and beverage companies generate nearly 630 million metric tons of greenhouse gases every year. Multinational corporations create the most pollution and profit the most off of unsustainable business practices, yet the new urban agenda does not target corporate stakeholders, nor does it include corporate social responsibility as one of its policy goals. Without undermining those structures, inequality increases because development in the global south currently depends on unsustainable industries, creating economic growth in lesser developed countries in exchange for exploitation of their impoverished workforce. Thirdly, the NUA is morally and fundamentally flawed due to the intentional exclusion of LGBTQ rights. We should not endorse a morally reprehensible document. The Habitat 3 conference in Quito purposely gave into pressure to exclude LGBTQ rights. The Guardian tells us in 2016 that the United Nations NUA has not acknowledged LGBTQ rights. During the negotiations of the agenda, a group of up to 17 countries led by Belarus, including Russia, Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Somalia, and Iran, blocked the inclusion of LGBTQ rights in the agenda, requesting their removal from a list of the groups the document condemns violence against. This is morally wrong and a compelling reason you should not endorse the Quito document and the NUA, because there cannot be a democratic and inclusive city that does not consider LGBTQ groups as first-class citizens with equal rights and freedoms. It's an essential issue. It's not important, it's essential, declares Barcelona Mayor Ada Colau outside the Habitat 3 grounds in Quito. This morally reprehensible exclusion brings into question the entire NUA document and the process. Finally, the narrow focus on urbanization and the new urban agenda forces a trade-off between different sustainable development goals, preventing achievement of all 17 of them and worsening climate change, something that Iman will get into later. Next, observation 2, we need to prioritize people and the planet, not cities. There are better goals to prioritize that are more conducive to solving sustainable development on a faster and more efficient timeline. The new urban agenda falls short of its own vision of eliminating the 3 major obstacles for sustainable development worldwide. First, the persistence of multiple forms of poverty. Second, growing inequalities. And third, environmental degradation. As we stated in the previous observation, the new urban agenda is a misguided blueprint to eliminate these 3 major obstacles. However, we agree that these obstacles must be addressed, which is why we advocate for the following 3 initiatives to be prioritized above the new urban agenda. First, promoting democracy through the United Nations Democracy Fund, Department of Peace Operations, Department of Political and Peace Building Affairs, and the High Commissioner for Human Rights by encouraging free and fair elections, increasing discourse, engaging peacekeepers to limit human rights abuses, and creating a resolution on the elimination of voter suppression to ensure we limit democratic breakdown. Second, enforcing corporate sustainability by creating a legally binding framework to eradicate human rights abuses and violations by multinational corporations and cap their greenhouse gas emissions, drastically following the framework of the current EU legislation against fast fashion by limiting imports and exports of goods by companies which fail to comply with these standards. And furthermore, enforcing these standards on multinational corporations is our best chance at solving the climate crisis because it will force the private sector to innovate on the necessary green technologies that need to be reached to reach the net zero emissions equation and mitigate climate harms. These 3 goals should be prioritized above the NUA because it recenters the focus away from urbanization and towards actually eliminating the fundamental obstacles preventing achievement. I began this case by telling you that you cannot fix the symptoms, you must cure the disease. For all these reasons and more, Iman and I proudly negate.
Are you ready?
Yes.
Sure. So at the beginning of your speech, you talk about the idea of creating new systems. Are the 3 examples you gave at the end of your speech those ideas of reworking the system or creating new systems?
Right. So this is all about addressing the systemic issues that are actually underlying all of the flaws that you identify in cities. So without solving these systemic issues, we have a new urban agenda that falls and fails on its face.
Yeah. So are you creating a new system is what I'm asking.
No, we're not creating a new system. We're specifically advocating for reworking the system that we have and fixing the systemic issues in the first place so that we can create the better cities the new urban agenda dreams of.
Okay, and can I get the text slash quote unquote plan text of the first 3 or the 3 things at the end of your speech? Sure. It was like free and fair elections and stuff. Yeah, thank you. Can you put it in the chat?
Yeah, no problem.
I appreciate it. Is it fine if I ask questions while you put that?
Yeah, go ahead.
For sure. So I guess how does your model that the negative has forwarded solve for things such as corporate sustainability or the minings and trees and stuff like that in rural areas?
Could you repeat your question, please?
Yeah. So you talked about the rural being a key focus for the negative. How do you engage with the mining that creates the violences in those areas?
Right, exactly. So what we clearly see is that by subverting it through corporate sustainability and like by avoiding that violence in the first place, by enforcing corporate sustainability reforms, you avoid all of the harms from neoliberalism and neocapitalism because we're allowing them to not have a blank check anymore to write against human rights abuses, to write against, exploitation of the environment and of people. By curbing that with a legally binding framework, you completely subvert all of those problems and you actually lead to the climate crisis being solved because you're going to innovate on green technology, which we need to implement, and Mom's going to go into later,
for sure,
in order to solve the climate crisis.
So for that, can I get the model that the negative entails?
Like what model?
Like, yeah, what would you defend? Is there a model you would defend or something that's different from the affirmative? Or is it just like the AF is bad, reject racism, et cetera, et cetera?
I'm kind of confused, and I think this is like a bit of like debate jargon here. Iman and I aren't policy debaters, so it's kind of important to like make this accessible. But going forward and trying to answer your question to the best of my ability, I think it's really important that we say that, if like we think that you have a morally reprehensible framework through the exclusion of LGBTQ people, and basically saying that, all of these countries have a free reign to continue violence and assault against them, which we think is morally reprehensible. And we also think that the new urban agenda, either way, falls flat because it's going to reproduce the same harms and inequalities we see in the status quo.
Yeah. So then does the negative do anything about that? Is it just reject what the pro side has talked about? Or is it like,
so as I said at the end, we advocate for the following 3 initiatives. Like I said, promoting democracy, enforcing corporate sustainability, and using corporate sustainability as a vehicle and a framework for achieving green technology that needs to be implemented.
I see. So then I guess in democracy and those, I guess the elections that you talked about, how are you inclusive for LGBTQ rights? If in the status quo, it's messed up right now.
Right, exactly. So by not subscribing to a morally reprehensible framework that like basically excluded LGBTQ individuals from it, we're basically reasserting to the LGBTQ community that the UN is not going to be an empty body that refuses to advocate for them. And instead, we're going through a route of like, first of all, reducing resource commitment because the UN is working on the new urban agenda. They can't work on all these things simultaneously. So having the United Nations divert their attention to this is going to be most effective.
Thank you. So then do you think the idea of democracy is good for LGBTQ rights?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Is there a model or is it a democracy that's different from the democracy that we see in different countries right now?
A democracy that's different?
Yeah. Like, is it the same?
We're reversing the trend of democratic breakdown.
Okay.
Can everyone hear me? I can't see. Just say yes. Okay. Just like everyone else, before I start, I just wanted to thank a couple of people quickly. The Atlantic Coast Conference for hosting this tournament and everyone who made it possible, including the judges. Dr. Susan Wente, the president of Wake Forest University. Dr. Michelle Gillespie, the dean of the college. Dr. Rogan Kirsch, the university provost. Mrs. Megan Medica for continued support of Wake Debate. Dr. Jared Atson, the director of debate, who was instrumental to the admission of my admission to the university. Mr. Justin Green, our coach of this tournament, my partner DeMarvin, and my family. I would just flow it on the same page. I'm going to start in 10 seconds. If someone is not ready, please unmute and stop me. Cool. The world is on fire and we don't have time to wait. The framework for this debate is which side establishes a strategy that can effectively offer solutions that can practically be implemented. It is not a question of ideal values, but manageable implementation solutions to the problems we face. The counter advocacy is simply just a description of things that are not incompatible with the new urban agenda. We thank the negative for their additional reasons why the new urban agenda is good. The ideas of democracy are already ingrained, but they need to be promoted more. That was the bottom of DeMarvin's speech. The new urban agenda explicitly endorses the value of public involvement. The idea that that green tech development and corporate sustainability reforms are in fact what cities are doing. The counter advocacy is simply not competitive. The rule of the negative is to disprove the resolution. That means they have to win that the advocacy solves the affirmative and the advocacy is mutually exclusive with the affirmative. That means that if we win, the counter advocacy and the affirmative could happen at the same time, or if the affirmative and then the counter advocacy could occur, then we should win the debate. They've made an argument about how prioritization of cities is bad. We do not need to specifically examine how cities operate, and they must be done so in a way that embraces development and economic growth. There's three arguments I'd like to make here. First is that urbanization is inevitable. Rural life is hard, mechanization of agriculture, and expansions of the suburbs into exurbs. Second, cities constitute 70% of global climate emissions, and that number is only going to rise because the pace of urbanization is going to increase. The rural is globally disappearing as suburban sprawl consumes small towns and mechanized farming is driving people as economic refugees to cities. Third, city planning influences emissions in three unique ways. ACC point is energy purchase. The vast majority of utilities around the world are either directly run or heavily regulate and influence how utilities produce energy. By encouraging public-private partnerships and creating global linkages for that to happen via the UN conversations, when cities create low-cost loans for solar, for example, this creates economies of scale so that the energy costs are saved by the city in the long run, and solar panels become cheaper for everyone. B subpoint is transportation. The vast majority of transportation emissions happen as people and companies move about cities, changing the commute. Their public planning goes a long way. And it can spur larger national changes. The planning of mass transit in a city has the best chance to jumpstart public transport questions throughout the country because cities are where the investors are located. C subpoint is innovation hubs. We've given the example of London, how they use city tax dollars to encourage new businesses to relocate and start up that can produce environmental sustainability and economic growth. Recognizing that urban centers are the best place for this type of development is necessary to solve the harms that negative introduces. The next argument they've made is an argument about how Habitat 3 excludes mentioning LGBTQ people. First, you should extend the argument that DeMarvin made at the bottom of his speech about how the new urban agenda is not a static document, and instead prioritizing it means that incorporating different perspectives and ensures that it can change over time. We look at what is working, what is not, and manage effectiveness. The second argument is an offensive one, and it's one that they're simply wrong that the new urban agenda is changing now. Margarela Versani writes that Ellen Wordsworth, the chairperson of Women Transforming Cities for the UN, is public to sign the Queer Declaration, a petition created to highlight the hardship faced by gender and sexual minorities, and it is urging this revision to the new urban agenda. They've made an argument about how we've excluded rural populations, but they can be done, that the affirmative can be done in a way that isn't exclusive to the rural. The counterplan can be done in a way that isn't exclusive to the rural. I can make it a priority to get good grades and call home to my mom. They've tried to do this example in cross-ex, but priority does not mean above all other initiatives. It just means it's important. In fact, it's possible to make cities more sustainable through the urban agenda while simultaneously recognizing how conversation about cities need to include conversations about the rural. The negative in this debate is judging a book by its title instead of looking at the details. In fact, we'll list some of the goals of the new urban agenda. Goal number 26 says, we commit ourselves to urban and rural development that is people-centered, protects the planet, and is age gender responsive. Goal number 28 about refugees searches for, quote, establishing frameworks that enable positive contributions of migrants to cities and strengthen urban-rural linkages. Goal number 36 says, quote, we commit ourselves to promoting appropriate measures in cities and human settlements in both urban and rural areas. Goal number 49 says, quote, we commit ourselves to supporting territorial systems that integrate urban and rural functions. This element about looking at the way that refugees flows happen is uniquely important, cannot be captured outside of the new urban agenda. The alternative of democracy, green tech, and corporate sustainability, refugee instability increase, risks conflict, and causes mass amount of death. The negative has said that 70% of our pollution comes from companies. That's accurate, but misleading. We'll quote the original source from the London Guardian, reported in 2017, quote, just 100 companies have been the source of more than 70% of the world's emissions. The Carbon Majors reports pinpoints how relatively small set of fossil fuels producers may hold the key systemic change to carbon emissions. Yes, we could say it's that fossil fuel producers are the problem, but a better question is, where do they get their business? The answer is cities. The UN and the IPCC both make clear that cities constitute 70% of the consumption of emissions. The problem with the negative is that we cannot shame coal companies out of business. You cannot ask for Shell oil to be corporately sustainable. The solution has to involve the question of altering how both we transport networks for commuting and utilities and how utilities produce energy. Both transportation and energy production are oriented around cities, since it's the commute to cities and energy consumption in cities. Just saying we need green energy, democracy, and corporate sustainability does nothing. Planning to encourage new cities to do so is the only option. And recognize the reality that urbanization is fundamentally inevitable, and the new urban agenda is the only way to grasp that urbanization. Independently, if you buy their arguments about being able to solve for climate change better, then the refugees' impact should be a tiebreaker in this round, because there's no way that they can create the infrastructure necessary in urban areas to support refugees and stop instability as a result of climate refugees. I'm good whenever you are.
Okay, awesome. I'll begin on my next word. Okay, so from the bottom up, why do you endorse like a morally reprehensible framework that basically targets LGBTQ people? Like, what is your argument against that?
Yeah, so we've made two arguments. One, the new urban agenda is not a static document. You've identified a flaw with it, and then we would obviously change that. We've read cards from the 1AC that indicate that prioritizing the new urban agenda means recognizing these flaws. The second thing is that I'd like to answer the question because this will be important later.
Okay, just quickly, please.
It's being addressed now. It's already being voted on to add LGBTQ people to the new urban agenda and identify the struggles they deal with, especially with homelessness.
Okay, moving on from that. So going on to this idea of priority just means important. How exactly does that work in the status quo? If priority just means important, the new urban agenda is already enacted, so clearly it's important enough for the UN to do it. So why should it be prioritized if we already see it's important? If it's one of many priorities, where do you get your?
I mean, I think the UN is very capable and they're able to prioritize multiple things at once. We've disagreed with your definition that just priority means is the first thing we should do.
Right, but wouldn't you say that if it creates trade-offs that basically cannibalize the plan towards sustainable development by 2030, that it should not be something that is prioritized?
We have disagreed with that assertion that it creates trade-offs, and we've actually said that prioritizing it, even if you win that we do prioritize it, is good because a focus on urban centers is where a mass majority of ecological harms come from.
Right. So moving on. So you're talking about public-private partnerships, but how do public-private partnerships stop companies from having disproportionate, climate impact as well as human rights abuses?
We agree that companies are the producers of climate change, but the evidence you've set to Samsat is energy companies and who consumes energy.
But I listed also food and beverage companies within my 1AC. So clearly we say this is a huge company issue, not just energy companies.
The evidence that you use to substantiate the fact that corporations create 80% of warming is mostly about the top 15 oil companies, and your response is just shaming them through
evidence than I was specifically. But we can just move on from that because I don't think that helps you at all. So if they're stakeholders, why would they hold themselves accountable? How are you going to have a mechanism to hold these companies accountable for curbing their emissions?
So we think that governance structures can hold them accountable. They have already bought into the NUA and they make a lot of
decisions. But buying into the NUA doesn't mean that you're curbing your emissions. Buying into the NUA doesn't mean that you're stopping your human rights abuses. How are you doing both of those things?
We've identified 15 plus examples in the bottom of the 1AC about what the NUA can look like. And all of these have existed while corporations exist. So they're obviously not a big enough force to just poison any effort to solve sustainability ever.
Right. Okay. But you say that it's existed while climate change has existed. Did I?
No, it's existed while corporations have existed.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but you're frozen on screen.
Okay. Yeah. I was just worried about being frozen. Okay. As long as you can hear me, that's fine. So moving on. So given that do you believe that there's a sequential approach to priorities?
No. In the context that you're using this in this loaded question, no.
How so?
Because the UN is capable and they're able to prioritize multiple things at once.
Right. So if I want to drive my car, don't I have to find my keys first?
No, that's a loaded question. If I want to do my homework on Saturday and prioritize it, that doesn't mean that don't brush my teeth when I wake up in the morning.
Right. But yeah, but those things have nothing to do with each other. You can brush your teeth without doing your homework. But if you want to drive your car, don't you need to
but the relationship between those two is not sequential. You have not won that prioritizing sustainability goals is the key thing to do the NUA.
Okay, well, we'll work on that. And then moving on, last question that we have here. So in terms of like your idea about like, like refugees being the tiebreaker, wouldn't you say that you need democratic governments who are actually going to care about refugees and also limit the amount of refugees that are being created?
Yeah, the time's up, but I'll answer the question. Democratic governments are not incompatible with the affirmative, and it's about urban planning to support the influx of climate refugees.
So everyone kind of did an intro, so I feel kind of left out if I don't. So I'm gonna have to do one too. First of all, thank you everyone for showing up. It's a great way to spend your Saturday. We live in Miami. There are definitely other things we could be doing, but we are very happy to be sat here and doing this. So props to everyone else for doing the exact same, especially the week before finals. Good luck with finals, professors and students. I hope grading doesn't kill you. Next, I guess, thank you to everyone for even organizing this tournament in the first place. It's been a pleasure to have the opportunity to learn about this topic and to even just have made it this far. So we're grateful for all of your input. Thank you to Wake Forest for being incredible competitors. You guys have been fabulous so far, and best of luck whichever way it goes. We both did ourselves justice. Thank you, coaches. And Delphine, she didn't say it, but this is her last ever tournament as a debater. So we're both a little bit emotional, but we're excited and honored to be here. So thank you and good luck to everyone. I will begin on my next word. You cannot fix the symptoms, you must cure the disease. Broken cities are symptoms of broken systems. The New Urban Agenda works within broken systems. Maria Kaika in 2017 states, in reference to the New Urban Agenda, that this old framework vaccinates citizens and environments so that they can take larger doses of inequality and degradation in the future. It mediates the effects of global socio-environmental inequality, but does little towards alleviating it. The topic statement tells you that the negative need to show you why the New Urban Agenda is undesirable in the status quo and why it cannot coexist with the negative world. We show that it's undesirable because of the trade-offs between the Sustainable Development Goals that we are forced to make it too great. And second, that its creation is built upon the backbone of exclusion, which we think is a net harm. And that our counter advocacy is competitive because the promotion of democracy and the promotion of corporate sustainability are prerequisites for any attempts at urbanization. First, the New Urban Agenda is tone deaf and impractical. The New Urban Agenda is a trade-off against its own Sustainable Development Goals, harming the credibility of the United Nations at stake. First, at the local level, efforts to achieve one Sustainable Development Goal, which the New Urban Agenda does, Sustainable Development Goal 11, can also lead to trade-offs in achieving other targets. For example, actions to meet a need for increased housing can lead to conversion of farmland and green areas, affecting the livelihood of farmers at the urban-rural interface, distributing ecosystems through convergence of local ecosystems, etc. We prove to you that the New Urban Agenda does not adequately solve or work towards all of the Sustainable Development Goals through the next following observations. We don't think that urbanization within itself is bad, but we think that the New Urban Agenda is bad because societies are not just cities. Rural areas exist too. The New Urban Agenda sacrifices the welfare of 3 billion people at the expense of sustainable development. Leaving a rural area behind is inherent within the document's actual policies. And the harms of this being, the Encyclopedia of World Problems states that leaving behind rural areas aggravates resource depletion, the absorption of rural communities, indiscriminate economic development, destruction of rural subsistence economy, and the degradation of agricultural land by cash crop. Delphine explained to you why ignoring rural areas cannot get you close to climate benefits, etc., and the effects on governance, such as rural backsliding and being the leading cause of democratic backsliding, etc., etc. So, by not accounting for rural areas, not only does the New Urban Agenda leave behind 3 billion people, it threatens sustainable development and threatens the minority groups that the affirmative says it attempts to protect. So, not only does the New Urban Agenda exhibit harms through its literal policy exclusion, but it exhibits harms through its framework and the way that it was created. Francesca Perry in Quito says that Canada, backed by European Union, United States, and Mexico, as well as Argentina, has for months pushed for the inclusion and recognition of LGBTQ people as vulnerable groups in the New Urban Agenda. However, the 17 countries that Delphine mentioned advocate for their removal from the list of from their list from the list as a group of people that we condemn violence against. The impact of this being, if you do not resolve for democracy, then you continue to have plans that leave people behind, and the LGBTQ movement is proof that that's already happening. This alone is reason enough to find immense harm in the new urban agenda, because the endorsement of that document is bad and unethical and something that should not be infirmed, because the exclusion of those people is advocacy or inherent ignoration for the violence that is perpetuated against it. Taking the LGBTQ community out otherizes them, leading to other kinds of violence. You can think of them as other, then you can think of any other kind of community as other, leaving them out of decision-making processes and saying that it's okay to subjugate these peoples to harm. So this document is fundamentally flawed and should not be enacted. And even if things can be tinkered to make it in terms of better in terms of urbanization, its initial framework being built upon the exclusion of other people makes it immoral, unethical, and something that should not be prioritized. And we explain the harms of the specific guidelines of the new urban agenda. We offer an alternative prioritization which resolves all of the problems and explain to you why you cannot do both at the same time. We explain to you that we want to protect the people and the planet, not cities, because there are things that are prerequisites to any of the benefits that we get on the affirmative side. The promotion of governance and Sustainable Development Goal 16 proves to you that democracy is at the core of a successful global system. Cities do not create governments, governments create cities, because global democratic breakdown and recession is the greatest obstacle to securing human rights. Continued democratic backsliding on several continents is paramount. This looks like the promotion of free and fair elections and tackling voter suppression. So we got this idea of refugees. Why are there refugees? There are refugees because Russia attacked Ukraine, because Russia's not democratic. Russia is the same people, through their lack of democratization, who wanted the exclusion of the LGBTQ communities. And there are also good governance and democracy also solves for the problems of refugees in the climate crisis, because we have a system that does not promote otherization of any communities. Refugees are otherized in any of the democratic systems that they go to. They flee countries because of bad governance, and even if it is because of climate instances, we don't want to enact a policy that supports the otherization of people that is the inherent nature of the new urban agenda. So why is it we also promote corporate sustainability? Because this subverts any issues of neocolonialism or neoliberal agendas. Nearly 2/3 of major industrial greenhouse gas emitters come from companies, and prioritizing the accountability of corporate stakeholders allows the inability to find loopholes in blanket government policies. The new urban agenda actually incorporates multinational corporations into the policy process, allowing them to be stakeholders so that they can promote their own agendas in the system. We say that holding corporations accountable as a prerequisite to any potential urbanization is in fact paramount, because then that allows access to the innovation of green technology that isn't fully developed to lead us to net zero emissions. We believe that the negative case tells you that you cannot fix the symptoms, you must cure the disease. Promoting governance, accelerating implementation and innovation of green technology, and global enforcement of corporate sustainability fix the structural underlying issues of systems that the new urban agenda wants to fix. We reject an agenda that works on the backbone of ignoring certain people, subjugating them to violence and direct harm. For all these reasons and more, Delphine and I are proud to negate.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Are you good?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm a little bit confused. I'd like to start with some clarification questions. The counter advocacy is endorsing green energy, democracy, and corporate sustainability. Which one of these things, or?
Yeah, so if we're doing it in a sequential manner, we promote the promotion of democracy is first and foremost, then the promotion of corporate sustainability. And we think a byproduct of corporate sustainability is that you get further innovation of green technology.
Yeah, so why are any of these three things incompatible with the affirmative?
Because we think that the promotion of democracy is something that you cannot have whilst you're believing in this coexistent form of the new urban agenda. When you have democracies and other things working on the exclusion of other communities. Second, you think you can't have the incorporation of corporate sustainability when you have corporate stakeholders in the new urban agenda entrenched. So we think these things make it completely.
So what does corporate sustainability look like without consulting corporate stakeholders?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I wasn't.
What does the actions that corporations can do to be more sustainable, what does that look like without talking to them about their energy usage?
I mean, you can talk to them, but it's like having legally binding mandates for them to reach for net carbon zero emissions, etc.
Okay, who implements these mandates? Is it the UN?
Sure.
Okay, so and then the second part is if it's the UN implementing and then you've problematized the affirmative for, we're not able to implement, then how does the counter
Well,
advocacy overcome this?
this can also look like I said like the UN, but this can also look like legally binding things from different countries, local governments, et cetera, et cetera. Accountability can be multi-leveled.
Okay, and then like what framework do they use to determine, like if different countries can do this individually, like what framework do they use to determine, what key performance indicators they should meet, what specific technology they use? How do they determine that on an international scale?
We don't think that's necessarily our burden. However, if it were the case, we could have legally binding like rules.
Wait, so if one country is just destroying the environment and there's no way to internationally force them to stop, like the counter advocacy just does nothing about that?
Well, we're saying that when you prioritize like the promotion of democracy as a prerequisite, you can then have those other things first. So you like the affirmative world is the idea that we urbanize and we get this like green cities, etc. But we're saying that without the promotion of democracy as a prerequisite, you
prioritizing democracy, like what does that look like? What does that mean? Like, do we just tell?
It'd be like preventing voter suppression laws in certain instances. The United Nations.
How? What is that like? You're just gonna tell Russia, like, stop, be more democratic. Tell Saudi Arabia, be more like. What does this look like?
Well, first of all, it's like the promotion and the prevention of democratic backsliding and the promotion of governance, which is Sustainable Development Goal 16. This can look like sending in, like UN, I've forgotten what they're called, but like the voter things that they have. That was a mischaracterization. Delphine will explain further, but to implement like policies such as ensuring that all people have access to free and fair elections, voter registration, et cetera, meaning that suppressive policies that can inherit and create democratic backslide are not promoted.
Okay. The next argument I want to talk about is this thing about corporations being the root cause of emissions. Which corporations are the largest ones?
I don't know, like the ones that emit the largest harms to the environment, I think, are the ones that we think.
If it's energy companies, my next question is who determines how that energy is used?
I think, wait, can you repeat that question and explain what you want? All right. Okay, thanks.
All right, I'll be using my 2 minutes of preparation time. Please tell me to stop. All right, cool. The world is on fire and we do not have time to wait. You can't kill the disease if we haven't produced a vaccine or medicine yet. Only our framework does this because it means that if we win that our strategy can effectively offer solutions that can practically be implemented, then we should win the debate. Even if they show how the NUA is unethical, this debate is not a question of ideal values, but of manageable implementable solutions, the problems that we face. We have multiple examples of how we are a prerequisite. This is where in the very first speech, we talked about the United Nations in 2022, discussing the idea of prioritizing equity as well as social justice and other factors, which proves that the NBA is not tone deaf, but actually listens to the issues that are key, that are focused on not only the environment, but also socially and politically on all different levels of urbanization. This means that this goes into the rural aspects, the LGBTQ aspects, the refugee aspects, as well as the notions of democracy. Now moving on, the refugee thing or framing. Refugee instability or a tie-breaking in this debate. Specific clauses in the new urban agenda mandate that cities develop the infrastructure for climate refugees. These do not exist in the world of the counter-advocacy or the model of the negative and their framework, because endorsing democracy in the abstract isn't able to solve anything. Because one, there are multiple examples of how democracies are not accepting refugees right now in the status quo. Think about the ways in which Biden literally send back multiple immigrants. Prove that there are multiple ways in which their model of democracy are bad. In the face of this, you can only hang your hat on the fact that the negatives counter advocacy is not competitive. There's no possible way you can explain to us after the round why we cannot just do both, the affirmative and then green energy, democracy, and corporate sustainability, if we have proven that we are a prerequisite or analysis that comes prior to that. Saying that we should do these things without the affirmative does nothing, because there is no way that they can implement these things on a global scale. That's why the NWA or the New Urban Agenda is important. Now moving on to the idea of the LGBTQ and rural stuff. I'll start on the rural. We deny exclude rural. We have extended how the NUA is able to adapt and have multiple prioritizations, such as sustainable development, i.e. the goals of 26, 28, and 36 that Eon talked about, that proves that we're able to engage with these communities as well as allowing for refugees to engage in different forms. This not only proves that we are able to have priority in multiple facets, but it proves that our model is better because we're able to talk about different aspects that have been bad in NUA, but have showed how we are flexible. The argument about LGBTQ people being excluded from the agenda, but they have not answered that the New Urban Agenda 1 is not a static document and that it can be adapted to flaws. That was the examples I've done above with the goals, and that this was a prioritization. It means that it's being removed now. We have read evidence that says how LGBT incorporation or has been incorporated within the New Urban Agenda. And even if there are cities or countries that neglect that, we're saying that this is why the value system of the New Urban Agenda is necessary, not only for the aspect of LGBTQ people, but also how they should engage specifically with different models of sustainability. We not at the very worst a massive net benefit or a massive reason why the affirmative is winning by doing both the affirmative and the advocacy is that city planning is key. We need to examine and plan how cities are engaging with sustainability efforts, which embraces development and economic growth. Urbanization is inevitable. They have literally conceded this and said that this is something they agree with. Since 1959, the population has increased to 4.8 billion. This has led to people in the rural going into cities and causing 70% of emissions, which means it's a prior question of framing and analyzing how cities come first because they do the most amount of ecological damage. This means that this is necessary to stop climate catastrophe and massive global poverty. Now, we have 3 examples of why city planning is key. First is energy purchase. Most of the utilities in the world regulate or influence how energy is produced. With private-public partnerships and global linkages through UN discourse, this allows for economies of scale which save more energy in the city and make it more affordable, such as solar panels and electric cars. These are where you put multiple examples that was coming out of the first speech, i.e. Oslo, Europe, New York, and a litany of other examples. 2 is transportation. Transportation emissions are possible through corporate and individual commutes through cities, but public planning makes mass transit give the best chance for a focus on how we should shift our transportation. 3 is innovation hubs. London is a key example. It uses tax city dollars to encourage new businesses to relocate and start up, which in turn creates environmental sustainability and economic growth, something that's necessary for everyone within the world. The argument about us excluding the rural was done above, but we have identified countless specific lines from the NUA that incorporates this and proves that there is no distinction between the prioritization of rural areas as well as cities. Also, this means that the negatives counter advocacy on an implementation level is not competitive. It means you must easily vote affirmative. Next is that we'll make a couple arguments on why their democracy is bad. Their forms of democracy is bad for multiple reasons. One, multiple forms of democracy in the real world right now are hybrid regimes that allow for corruption in the political, allow for racialized violence in the social, as well as bad economic growth that depend on oil companies. Key example are Latin America. All these examples are how they have not proven a good or perfect model of democracy that should make you skeptical of how you engage with their model first. They have said that it is a sequence question under their interpretation or their model, i.e. democracy first and then everything else. If we have proven that their first sense is messed up, then it means that you should reject their entire system as a whole, meaning that endorsing democracy in the form of the NUA ensures the best type of negotiation. Vote aye.
I'll be taking my 2 seconds of cross-check starting now. Oh, prep, sorry. Begin on my next word. Am I audible to everyone? Awesome. We open the negative case by telling you that you cannot fix the symptoms, you must cure the disease. Cities are nothing more than the symptoms of the broken and diseased societies they're built in. Promoting democracy and global enforcement of corporate sustainability that will lead to green tech innovation and widespread implementation fix the systemic issues underlying the symptoms that create the cities the new urban agenda wants to fix. This is why Iman and I are privileged to debate in today's round. There are some key aspects that we really need to tackle in order to create some clarity within this round. First is this issue of mutually exclusivity and competitiveness. Second, about corporations and corporate sustainability, which I think is one of the main parts of this round and clearly links to climate change, which they assert our world is on fire. I'm going to get to that. And finally, democracy as a prerequisite to anything that the new urban agenda is going to establish. So first, let's get to our framework. Imad reminds you that cities do not create governments. Governments create cities. The problems of cities are dependent on systemic issues which hinge on implementation. The Trojan horse of the new urban agenda should be left at the gates because it reproduces the inequalities they claim to eliminate through a neoliberal and neocolonial approach and marginalizes the most vulnerable groups among us, LGBTQ plus communities. The affirmative tells you that urbanization is inevitable, which makes the moral imperative that cities develop sustainably all the more crucial. Yet if you're sacrificing the climate, human rights, and democracy to urbanize, can we really call that sustainable, the responsible sustainable development? If you don't subvert the status quo, you're doomed to create it. The reason you cannot do both is because the new urban agenda forces us to make too many trade-offs. First, it cannibalizes its own sustainable development goals, as Iman explained to you in the Fred Capote evidence. Furthermore, it prioritizes a morally reprehensible framework that excludes LGBTQ individuals. And if they're able to exclude LGBTQ individuals, who else are they willing to otherize? This is incredibly problematic and something that you cannot support. We see that an affirmative ballot is inherently a homophobic and a transphobic ballot. We should not engage that in today's round. Furthermore, what we tell you is that even if you buy that you can have multiple priorities, as we've been going back and forth within today's debate, at the end of the day, the framework here should be hinged on urgency, which we told you in our first speech. What should we accomplish the most in the next 10 to 15 years to guarantee the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals? They tell you that the world is burning and is on fire. So if you are in a burning house, what is your first priority? Maybe you still care about getting good grades. Maybe you still care about calling your mom. But the first thing that you do right then and there is that you try to put out the fire and you get out of the house. What we're doing on the negative is that we are putting out the fire. The fire is the systemic issues. The fire is democratic backslide. The fire is corporations releasing the most emissions into the atmosphere. Insofar as you do not put out the fire, you have no other priorities. So maybe multiple priorities can exist, but the key word here is urgency. It's a prerequisite because they're telling you that the new urban agenda is going to have all of these benefits once it's implemented. Who implements the new urban agenda? Given that's a non-binding framework, governments. If governments are not good, then they're not going to implement the new urban agenda. Do you really think Russia's caring about the new urban agenda right now? Do you really think that they're implementing it while they're bombing Ukraine? Absolutely not. So we clearly see that having good governance is the key to getting any of the impacts that you believe about the new urban agenda on its face. So specifically, what we get into is that even if you take the affirmative at their absolute best, they don't tell you why the new urban agenda itself is urgent and how our plan is not a prerequisite. So even if you believe it's important, you still vote for the negative because Iman's speech explains in detail why democracy, why green tech, and why corporate sustainability are more urgent and therefore take priority. First of all, she tells you that green tech solves for the environment better because we do not yet have all the technologies that we need to solve the net zero equation that's going to help us overcome the climate crisis. And so by enforcing corporate sustainability reforms through a legally binding framework that is reminiscent of what the EU is doing right now with fast fashion by limiting imports and exports from companies that don't comply, then we're going to see that they're going to have to create green tech in order to maintain their profit incentive. And by doing that, we're going to solve the rest of the net zero equation, which is going to lead to climate crisis becoming solved immediately because we're putting corporations basically to work and we're also limiting their carbon emissions immediately. Insofar as the affirmative doesn't do any of that, you side with the negative because the negative provides you the clearest, the best option to how we're going to subvert all of these crises. Then we get into the fact that they leave rural populations behind, which I think is huge because one thing that we get and that another reason why we're mutually exclusive and you should not want to implement the new urban agenda is that by having the focus on new urban agenda on urban populations, you make democratic breakdown even worse because rural communities become resentful and they vote for people who put in policies that are not climate friendly. We get people like Marine Le Pen who are threatening Brexit. We get rural British people who voted for Brexit that destabilized the EU. You get resentful rural people who have put far-right leaders in power from Brazil to India. The worse democratic breakdown gets, the more impossible it will be to solve sustainable development. And even if you don't buy that the threat of democratic breakdown or necessity of innovating on green tech or the ramifications of not enforcing corporate sustainability are urgent, we still win because our first observation showed you that the new urban agenda actually threatens achieving the sustainable development goals through all of the trade-offs. But I want to end with this fact that the negative world is the only world that actually tackles the priority of sustainable development by eliminating the obstacles in the way of making a reality for all of us. We should not and cannot assert or endorse a document that excludes LGBTQ individuals on its face. We should not endorse that marginalization. But what we do is that we don't piss off rural people who will vote for populist leaders that will worsen sustainable development, or ignore that mining, fishing, and for-profit agriculture also contribute significantly to climate change. And we also ensure that we don't give corporations a free pass to continue exploiting people and exploiting the environment. So insofar as we want to rectify the climate crisis, as well as protect people and all people, not just people that Russia thinks are okay, then we are proud to negate. Thank you.
Good round.
Good debate.
Round of applause for all the debaters. Amazing work, amazing work. We now turn it over to our fine panel of judges. They will submit their electronic ballots that they have, and then Ed Lee has agreed to once again return as chair for the ACC Debate Championship and will announce a decision whenever the ballots are completed. to take it from here.
Charging battery.
Well, there we go. Well, congratulations to both teams for an outstanding debate round and getting to the final round. And as demonstrated by the results, the decision was a 3-2 for the University of Miami. Congratulations, Hurricanes. So I can start here because I'm one who's on the bottom. I think the counter plan or advocacy solves 100% of the app, and maybe even better than the app. And that's a real difficult spot to be in and to still have the vote affirmative. The problem is that I don't think there's a net benefit to your counter advocacy. I'll go through 3 of them very quickly so we can get to the other judges. Your LGBTQ argument, I thought was interesting and creative, and I'm really sort of excited to see that being a part of a policy level discussion. The problem is that they make 2 arguments that I don't think is ever answered. The new urban agenda is not static. It's something that can change, that can be innovative, and they read this piece of evidence, or they make an argument that it is already changing in order to incorporate those particular ideas. I also like your rural backsliding argument. The problem is that they make the argument that goal 26, 28, and 36 don't exclude rural communities. In fact, it's written in order to incorporate them into the agenda. There's not a direct response to that, although I think that they can, that you probably do have some. The place where I thought I was going to end up voting negative was on this internal trade-off argument that they convert rural farmland as a part of doing some things to shore up things that are happening. The challenge that I have is that there are 2 ways in which I think you are extending this argument. First, as you say, the Caputo evidence. I'm not even sure if that is the right name of what we're referencing of that particular argument, but you don't tell me what that argument is. You don't reference farmland conversion. You don't reference explicitly the ways in which the treaty has these internal contradictions to it. And then at the bottom, you identify that there are internal trade-offs. I'm not quite sure what exactly that is. I would be troubled to speak to Wake Forest and say, here are the things for why there's a net benefit to the counter plan, and not being able to explicitly identify what those trade-offs are when they are not mentioned in the final speech. And so the other final thing I'll mention here is that I do think that you could have leveraged your priorities argument that it needs to come first as a way of evaluating the counter advocacy versus the advocacy. That if you prove that you are as good or better than their advocacy, then it is an indication that we don't need to prioritize the new urban agenda. It doesn't need to come first because there is something that is equal or better to it. That is another way you could have gotten me to vote negative. I think it solves everything, and it's congratulations. I think you debated very well, both sides.
I was the other dissenting judge, so I will go next if that's okay with other folks. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Atchison and Steinberg, for having me, and congratulations to both of these teams. This was a great debate. It was an excellent one for the final championship debate. It's like I said this last year, and I'll say it again, the ACC debates and everybody wins. These are 2 teams who are representing your debate teams, your universities, and yourselves so well. So you should be very proud of your performance in the debate tonight. I voted affirmative for Wake Forest. I agree definitely with the things that Ed Lee has already mentioned. I also had some trouble with the kind of urgency and mutual exclusivity with the counter plan. I thought that the arguments about climate refugees and the inevitability of increasing urbanization is very urgent and worth trying to address via the new agenda. And I had no doubts about why urban planning would be beneficial to address climate refugees and urbanization in that trend. It was a solution that might succeed immediately, urgently, even if longer term things like democratic reform or investing in green technology would also be things that can help safeguard long-term the viability of the environment. So I thought it would be worth it to try the affirmative proposal, or that it might be possible to sort of simultaneously do both of the proposals. Everybody, I'd love to give compliments to every person here. That might take forever. There are a bunch of other judges. So one kind of compliment I'd love to give is that everybody really seemed to have researched a topic in depth, and everybody here was considering and deliberating on potential solutions to really global problems. And you all seemed very prepared, and you just did excellent. So thanks for letting me be part of it.
Who wants to go, Dave or Jan? Do you? Okay, I saw Dave, you had a similar haircut to mine, and Jan, I have much love for it, so I wanted to extend that invitation. But let me first start off by saying, echoing what Becca has just said, Ed alluded to it as well, an amazing debate. You all did your institutions well, you did yourselves well, you did the activity well. I am proud to be associated with an activity that allows for young people like yourself to articulate, advance argument, advocate. You all are the best and the brightest that this country has to offer, that the world has to offer, that the universe has to offer. Let's get universal here for a moment. So I'm just ecstatic to be in the same time and space with each and every one of you. All are scholars, intellectuals, and I just hope that you continue to use your voice, your gifts to effectuate positive change in the world and speak truth to power. So everything I say after that is just kind of like blow in the wind. I know y'all want to hear about the decision, but that was the most important thing I could lay at your doorstep tonight, is to just let you know you're doing the right thing, you're in the right activity, and that you will continue to be lifelong debaters. Is my hope and my prayer as you continue to move forward. So how did Professor Rowland come to a different conclusion than Ed, Lee, and Becca? Well, it's real simple. I did see the counterplan solving everything. And my issue is that if you have not proven why it should be a priority at the end of the day. So I differ with Ed in the sense that I defer to the AV. I actually defer negative in those type of debates. So I think it's just a matter of just interpretation of how you evaluate a debate. I also think there's some couple of arguments. I think the negative, you're the only ones in the debate providing a definition of priority. You're the only ones that are telling me, giving me some kind of bright line or standard by which to look at that debate. And in Wake, I thought what you did was just kind of like, you can do multiple things. You can do multiple things, and that was really, whew, man. I was like, can't do everything. You can't, and I recognize that you were trying to get persuasive, like, I can have a test that's a priority, but I can still go out and party, kind of thing. And I'm sympathetic to that. Obviously, I'm not going to say I did not, that didn't resonate with me. But I think but what Miami did was a process argument, like, the keys before you can get in the car type thing. I thought their argument that governments create cities, not cities create governments, was powerful for me. Was powerful. So that the democracy argument becomes critical, that if we don't have democratic systems and frameworks, then it's impossible for the type of city planning, urban planning, all the other things that your advocate is kind of hinged upon, if those things are inherently corrupt from the beginning or are problematic from the beginning. So that's another thing. And then I think they do a really good job toward the end of articulating this backlash, kind of like the type of politicians that we have that would get voted in because of the Trump arguments. They do a litany of that. I thought that was really good, especially in the last rebuttal. And I think that supercharges the reason for why I don't want to prioritize or why I wouldn't want to go to AF, because it pushes us even further from being able to solve all the problems, including your refugees argument, because it's not like refugee crisis. You articulate it's a short-term problem, but not so much short. Elections are happening all the time. So I saw those things as kind of intertwined with each other. It wasn't like it was a long time frame. The democratic kind of ideals and elections, or were, as far as I'm concerned, the time frames were overlapping with one another. But that's something that both sides could have done a little bit better job of distinction. The only other parts of the debate that hadn't really talked to, and I'm happy to talk some more. I thought they are winning some uniqueness around the urbanization argument, around the fact that it makes it worse in rural areas because they get disadvantaged because of the ways in which you promote smart cities or promote a focus on urban areas. And in terms of the LGBT debate, the way I saw this debate, and this is, I wish would have had a little bit more time, but I thought the second negative speaker did a really good job just talking about why we should ignore things on face. I do think you are bumping up against that weight by saying it's going to change, it's static. I mean, it's not static, but the reality is I interpret Miami's position in this debate, it was already inherently flawed, and that I shouldn't want to be even remotely associated with a document that has already been tainted. And so that's the way I interpret that, even though it may be changing, even though it may be evolving, the fact that it started out from the gate being problematic is not something that I want to be associated with. And I'm not certain, because of that it's constantly changing, that it won't go back to excluding those folks anyway. So once again, awesome debate, everyone. I'm just so thoroughly impressed. If y'all did not get the memo, I'm just happy to be in this time and space with each and every one of you. So I'm gonna turn it over to my other awesome, amazing colleagues. I don't know who wants to, Jan or David, who would like to go next.
I can go briefly because I think James has hit the highlights that I agree with. But first and foremost, like everyone has said so far, I always love judging these. These are incredible debates. Every debate I've ever judged at these, I learned something, which makes me feel good. And you all did an incredible job. This is going to be something I'd be happy to show my students, and I hope they watched. I told them it's on YouTube. So I'd love them to see this. And it's an incredibly close debate. And, I grew up debating topicality, and I like the fact that someone defined prioritize and made me think about it. And I'm always a fan of asking ourselves, what does the resolution really want us to answer? And I do think priority, as I mentioned earlier, we had a tornado siren go off just for the debate. And I left my computer up and ran into the basement because that was my priority. This was important. I'm like asking my wife, should I go back up and get the laptop? And like, no, I think I'm gonna stay in the basement for a bit. So I think that's the key argument for me. And also, I do like a little bit of the discussion of whether or not we need systemic change. It reminded me a little bit of Karl Marx in a way that, are we ready for Marxism, or do we have to get things in place before we can do it? That, along with the backlash type argument where we get Trump, and I think specifically they said, pulling out of the Paris Accord, do we even get the follow through and implementation if we have that backlash? So I'm pretty much in the same boat as James, where I saw those are the things that I saw as being the most important. The arguments I like the most from the affirmative team, I think you're winning the argument. I think the motion asks that urbanization is happening, it's going to happen. And the house is on fire arguments, the argument I would be making, but I think you need to make it more clear that why we would even want to follow through with a plan or an action that isn't perfect, because if we don't take action now, trying to reshape the entire system won't get us here. What is the threshold or timeline for this catastrophe that's coming? Would have nudged me maybe to your side on this one. That would have been the difference maker for me. I'll turn it over to Jan, but once again, excellent debate.
I would just like to start out with thanking Jared and Dave for putting this all together and inviting me back to judge for it. I really do love coming to this tournament and really seeing a lot of amazing debates. And I would like to thank all of the debaters, because this really was, as everybody has said before me, a phenomenal debate. And I think this is a great exemplar of what a public debate ought to look like. I thought it was understandable for people who weren't experts in it. I think it was well researched and well documented, but it articulated in a way that didn't sound overly academic. And so I think that you all are doing everything that, as an educator, we would hope that you would do in this style of debate. And I want to echo what James had said, that what matters is what you take out of the activity and where you go forward in life, and not just winning a tournament. And I think that when I see you all, it gives me hope for the future. And I'm awfully cynical, so that's not easy to do. So kudos to you all for putting on a tremendous performance. In terms of my reason for decision, I feel very similar to what James and Dave had both said. And I kind of looked at it from a couple of perspectives. The first thing I looked at is I looked at the priority argument. And I do agree that they had a definition of, the negative had a definition of priority, where the affirmative just kind of had an explanation of what they view priority as. And I think that definitions matter to me. And I think that that means that I have to look is, does your policy have to be the first thing that we do? And I think that they hold you to that standard. And when I look at, so that's kind of the overarching frame by which I kind of evaluate and filter the other arguments that follow. So I look at both of the plans, and since neither plan really has an enforceable mechanism by which to implement it, and I think this is true of both the plan and the counter plan, that they're both aspirational and they both are reliant upon governments or people willing to live up to the aspirational ideals. And when that happens, I have to look at the question of the democratic governance. And to me, like, if it's an aspirational idea and we really have to account for governments and hope the governments do the right thing and stick with it and not pull back like the Paris Accords and Trump, that I think that democratic governments are probably the best option under that world. And in order to strengthen democratic governments is kind of something that needs to happen for either the plan or the alternative to be able to do the goals that they have. And I do think that both plan and the counter plan both have a reasonable, like, if they were done well, I think both would solve. And so I think the way that we get them done well, or at least better, is through democratic governance. And so as a priority, I think that the democratic governance needs to happen before the new urban agenda were to happen. And that's ultimately why I voted for Miami. But great debate, everybody. It was really a fantastic debate.
Once again, round of applause to our judges. Thank you all for a Saturday evening, spending it here with us. And congratulations to the University of Miami, the 2022 ACC Debate Champions. Congratulations. If possible, we'd love for the debaters to stick around on Zoom so we can get a quick screenshot of the four of you all together on a Zoom, or as I see you all are together at Miami, that'd be great. Maybe we get the Wait kids on the same camera as well. To everyone else, we'll say thank you. We hope that we see you all next year, and ideally in person. So keep your fingers crossed that we can make that happen. For everybody else, thank you again for all of your help. We'll see you later.